It's a new year. Lead us. Good.
There we go. I'm going to take off my mask so you can see my lips. It's so strange to say that, but hi everyone, I'm Diana Delgado. I'm the literary director here at the Poetry Center, and I'm really, really excited to hand the mic over to Kate. But before I do, I just have a few tiny announcements that I want to sort of check in with everyone about. I want to just give a shout out to the many volunteers from the creative writing, from the MFA department who helped Paula Valenzuela, who's our event coordinator, who basically sets things up for us every time we have an event. And she also takes things down every time we have an event. But the MFA department came out and helped, and they're going to help us also put away chairs. So I just want to make sure that I acknowledge that, because it's just so come on, it's just I'm thankful about that. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that our next reading is February 17th in the reading and lecture series, and we will be hosting Jay Hopler and Kimberly Johnson, and we hope that you can make that out, come out to the reading, and I promise you it will be warmer. So I won't be like a polar bear. You won't have to feel like somebody who's living somewhere outside of Tucson. So just sharing that part. And then there's calendars on the way out, because we sent them out a little bit later this year, but we have Marwa Halal, who's coming out. She has a new book. Marcela Hernandez Castillo, Seshu Foster, and Donika Kelly, who are going to be coming as part of the reading and lecture series. So the dates and, same time, 7 p.m., but, just grab one of these calendars. Just a quick note, the UA Prose Series readings are co-sponsored by the UA College of School and Behavioral Sciences and the Department of English. And additional support for the 2021-2022 Reading and Lecture Series was provided by Innovations in Healthy Aging, which is a strategic collaboration led by the University of Arizona Health Sciences, rethinking what it means to thrive while aging. So thanks, everyone. I will now take a seat and allow Kate to introduce the amazing Joy Williams. Gracias.
Diana, I didn't know you had the power to control the weather. I knew you were very extraordinary, but that's I'm very impressed. We must talk. I'm actually not introducing Joy Williams. I'm introducing the introducer, because this is the Poetry Center, and what would it be without the introducer to the introducer to the introducer? But welcome to the University of Arizona MFA Program's 2022 Distinguished Visitor Series in Creative Writing, previously known as the Prose Series. I'm Kate Bernheimer, professor of English, and I coordinate the series. This event will last around 45 minutes for those of you whose first reading this is, and I know it is for some of you because I see students here who've told me, so welcome to everyone. I hope you brought some hot toddies or hot chocolate or blankets. This is great. I also want to thank tonight the Poetry Center staff, especially Diana and Paula, for their generous support of this event, and the MFA students, Rea, Lucia, Jeremy, and Aria, and anyone else who showed up for helping set up and then staying later and breaking down chairs for us. That's just really incredible. Thank you. And thanks to all the other people. Oh, thank you. We really have just an amazing community of graduate students here. We're so lucky. Thank you to the Department of English for supporting this little series that could, and to the UA bookstore staff, whom I think are here with books for sale. Through the rituals of storytelling, we connect to ancient times and to each other. Staged readings like this imitate the hearthside, imitate caves, whether in person or over the ether tonight, because we're joined from around the world by a number of audience members, you have made the bold, old move of cherishing wonder. So thank you. I am not only a professor in the MFA program, I am a graduate of it. Around 30 years ago, I moved to Tucson because I loved the desert and I loved the work of Joy Williams, and I wanted to study with her. And I've been studying ever since. I've learned so much from Joy Williams. I know, for one thing, there is no such thing as a vodka martini, because I made the mistake of ordering one in her presence, to her horror. And I know how to speak tortoise. I also know I would be too nervous to introduce her to you tonight. And so it is my pleasure that this honor goes to one of my current students. How strange it is that things go full circle like this. Brian Randall is an MFA candidate in fiction here at the University of Arizona, and some of you may be enrolled in his courses because our graduate students have a really important job as teachers, as well as coursework as students. I'm proud to share that Brian Randall's work has been published in the Penn Review, among other places. I'm going to share with you two brief passages from a haunting story of Brian's called The Black Thread that I recently read, which reminds me so much of Joy Williams. His work, like hers, is quietly spirited, spiritual, cautious, and wise. She showed them to me in the morning, the dry husks of their skin picked from the brittle weeds below the kitchen window. I could hold them for a moment, feel the sharp edges of the diamond-shaped scales and the smooth rungs of the underbelly before they started to disintegrate in my hands, leaving behind a flaky dust that seemed to cling to my palms for the rest of the day. Grandma kept them in a jar, one with a heavy glass lid. For what? I don't know. I think she just liked to collect things, to keep whatever objects she found that seemed just shy of ordinary. A vacant bird's nest, dry and brittle. A jewelry box, painted with parrots. Grandma's in the sitting room. The black thread lays in a tangled mess over her lap, dangling from her outstretched fingers in a frantic mockery of a cat's cradle, trailing all the way down to the floor. She looks down at it, puzzled, then up at me. Can you thread the needle for me, dear? It's here somewhere. Oh, sometimes it feels like my head has a hole in it, for everything to just slip in and out as it pleases. Grandma, maybe we should put it away for tonight. How about some tea? It will help me sleep. When I go back, Grandma has a shoebox of photographs open on her lap. She's shuffling through a stack of them. Look, she says. I remember it like it was yesterday. Granny Edna with her little dog, Chief. Please join me in welcoming Brian Randall, or Chief.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening, everyone. It's my great honor to be introducing Joy Williams tonight. Joy Williams has been an influential voice in American fiction for nearly 50 years. She has published 5 collections of short stories, a collection of essays, a travel guide, and 5 novels, including The Changeling, The Quick and the Dead, and most recently Harrow, which was published this past September. Her work has received notable recognition, including the Rea Award for the short story, the Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts, and the 2001 Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction. She has also been the finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the National Book Critics Circle Award. There's much to say about Joy Williams' work. In reading it, I find myself thinking about those larger things that seem always just out of reach. I also find myself laughing a lot. But what I love most about Joy Williams' writing is that it constantly surprises. It defies any expectations. Characters spend entire books in proximity to one another and never interact. The characters we least expect are often in possession of the most lofty philosophies, the farthest reaching questions, the strangest fears. Sentences slip through, entirely wild and untamed, that read like the last synaptic failings of some fizzling universal consciousness. Joy Williams seems always to be writing towards some threshold, death or ecological calamity or nothingness, though often, like the people in her stories, we are not sure which side of that threshold we are on, or if we could even comprehend the distinctions. But personally, I don't know if there is anything more sure, more certain than uncertainty. Please join me in welcoming Joy Williams to the podium.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. And I'm so afraid it's too cold for everybody because I was going to read a little chunk, that's maybe 25 minutes. I could read a shorter little chunk. You sure? Okay. Thank you. If I see people, it's cold. So the portion I'll read tonight comes near the end of Harrow, where a 10-year-old Judge Jeffrey is holding court. To sometimes test those who come before him, the judge shows two seemingly identical pictures and asks the differences between them be enumerated. Or he asks the defendants to explain Kafka's story, The Hunter Gracchus. He has recently dismissed the girl Kristen, whom he has met in a previous life or afterlife, when they resided at a decaying resort on a large, dead lake. This is me trying to familiarize yourself with what comes next, which I'm sure isn't helping at all. But again, thank you so much for coming to the reading. Jeffrey was in his chambers, dipping a cookie into a glass of milk. "It doesn't make sense," he said soundlessly and widened his eyes. "It's not fair," he mimed and pouted. The milk wasn't satisfactorily cold. It wasn't easy to keep milk cold once you started to drink it. It was well nigh impossible. "I don't understand why I'm here," he whined soundlessly in imitation. Usually he wasn't this mean. He did not mock or presume. He did not take his position for granted. He was dignified and appreciative. He loved his work, the law. He was born for the bench. Because of his seniority and at his request, he didn't get the drunks. The drunks gave him hives, and they made him very, very impatient. He'd take a mass murderer or technological utopian over a drunk any day. But in general, those who came before him were all pretty much the same. He kept in mind the note Darwin had scribbled to himself when he was hashing out evolution. Never use the words higher and lower. He'd buy that note if he could, get a nice frame for it. Maybe it would come up for auction. Stuff always did. There'd always be collectors, always vaults. Better to store seeds than scribblings, in his informed opinion, however. He put the cookie and milk aside, best part of his day, cloying aftertaste and all. He'd wearied of the frightened surprise the majority exhibited in the courtroom when they perceived him, a mere child. At the age of 10, neurological development is pretty much complete. He'd sometimes take the bother of telling them, "You knew that, didn't you?" They did not. There were things he'd like to do, sure. He'd like to change his name. He'd like to be called Enoch. From henceforth, Enoch, who was taken from earth by the Almighty without passing through death. You'd think more would have been made of such an accomplishment. He'd like to play in the snow. He'd like to make a snowman, but there was no snow. He'd like to shout, "Clear the courtroom." He'd always wanted to do that. though it would be frightfully irresponsible. Yet he'd had that interesting case this morning. Her visit was not totally unexpected. You, he thought, all but born you. He ruffled himself in his black robes, much as a bird would in her feathers. Clear the courtroom, he said, without speaking, playfully. Jeffrey, Enoch, went to the windows and looked down toward the park. There was the interesting case, quite alone. As an interesting case, she could anticipate no present moment. She possessed only the future, which she was still powerless to change. He studied her a while longer in the shrunken space before which she fretted. Even in his time, it had been larger. A sacred grove, a temenos. It had once been asylum, and within it was one Asulos, the inviolable. It protected what was within and excluded that which was without. You can't beat Greek, he thought. He felt a special relationship with the great Hellenes. They had invented logic, had they not? Temenos. The word comes from temno, to cut, something cut from the meaningless, profane layer of life, something removed and isolated for a special purpose. In fact, it was the trees that had been cut, for there had been many more, even in his time, a veritable grove of them. Now there was the one, and there were designs on that. He'd heard the rumors in his own courtroom. Once that tree came down, the place could be rechristened as a soccer field. First thing to be established after a catastrophe, or after a war peters out. Shows it's okay to have fun again. Shows the indomitability of the human spirit. Outside the park, the earth was spongy, flooded, soft. It was practically smoking, a not fit dwelling place. How small the enclosure had become. He glanced at the sky, disheartening. The Greeks were blind to blue and green. They would have perceived the sky to be in fact what it was, an extramentitious brown. He had told her to come back. What a folly, perhaps even an injustice. It was unprecedented. But he was curious about her, and of course she dizzyingly brought back that peculiar interlude when he was adrift, dependent, when he didn't know what he was, uncomfortable in his own skin. But he'd had the law even then, which he could mimic, and the law's blustering treaties with the dead. He pictured the hunter Gracchus in his courtroom, fresh off the black bark, ice encrusting its rotting sails, carted in under a floral bedsheet. His presence would be no more unusual than what had happened that day, with her showing up. But he was confident that with a little ingenuity, he could resolve that case. Gracchus was just the simple man of the forest, at sea, a fish out of water, not up to the demands of his situation. He'd issue a few writs, tour the vessel perhaps, find the wormhole. Kafka need not be involved. Gracchus, the literal expression in a concrete image of an abstraction. That was what Kafka did best. And what a comedian! The peculiar painting in the ship's cabin, the doves, the 50 little boys in attendance, Gracchus's dog. Had there been dogs? He frowned. He'd been told he had a mind like a steel trap. He did have a mind like a steel trap. But did Gracchus have dogs when he fell down that ravine? He returned to his desk and picked up the same pages he had given her to read. He read them carefully. There was the wind, the wine, the doltish inquiries, always the wrong questions. There were the 50 little boys. But the dogs had vanished from the story for some reason. Jeffrey suddenly felt a great weariness. He rubbed his eyes. His grandfather had told him that if he rubbed his eyes religiously, as it were, he'd make them larger and thus be more commanding in court. The diameter of the human eye is about 10% of the height of the head, his grandfather said. If you could boost your eye index up to, say, 18%, 20% would be superb. you'd have them quaking in their undies. Dad, Dad, his father would say, you're scaring him. I am not scaring this boy, his grandfather would say. You're scaring me, Dad. That's because you are not him, his grandfather would say. You're a burbling disappointment, a little teapot. Jeffrey, his grandfather would address him once more. Glaucopus, owl-eyed, the great Athena's epithet. Wisdom, Jeffrey, knowledge. Let the great owl-eyed Athena be your guide. And Jeffrey would rub his eyes until they burned. Oh, what was the point? Sure, he was commanding in court. Sure, he had them quaking in their undies. But what were wisdom and knowledge these days? Knowledge had deteriorated into mere detection and diagnosis, and you could train a giant pouched African rat for that. In 3 weeks, a giant pouched rat from that once intriguing continent could be taught to sniff out landmines as well as most drugs and weapons. They could detect cancer in the unsuspecting too, but their trainers didn't want to burn them out with the boredom that too much success brings. In any case, everyone had cancer these days. Cancer, Parkinson's, leukemia, tumors, the sugar. Even a rat needs a challenge. Owlet Jeffrey Enoch longed for the pickup another cookie would bring, but he was an owlet of habit and structure. There would be no second cookie. He gave his eyes one more nostalgic swipe, left his chambers, and descended to the courtroom to confront all those who had fallen under his jurisdiction. It's a serious matter to allow someone to wander among the living after their death, or before they were born, or, as she had argued, before their birth was fully accomplished. Is that what she'd said? Yes. And he had said that many feel that way about themselves without actually being aware of it, by which he meant that they become human without knowing the first thing about it, the requirements and such. That is, they suspected they were meant to be more or different, but fumbled about in the smoky light of half-realized lives instead. That is, he never should have sent her away. What if something befell her and she didn't come back? Maybe he should go out and get her. But that would be unprecedented too. That would be the 8th day, all right, the one that St. Augustine refers to after the 7 days of creation, the one with no evening in it. Your Honor, some supplicant was murmuring, I accept the unethical acts of my past. I tell you this sincerely, and I wish, therefore, to alter their meaning. Excuse me, Enoch said. Alter their meaning? That's a good one. What's your name? Castor. As in Castor and Pollux? Where's your brother? I don't know no Pollux. I'm not responsible for no Pollux, but I accept the unethical acts of my past and wish to be allowed to alter their meaning. You don't want forgiveness then? I don't believe there's any benefit to that, is there? What's it feel like accepting your past? I feel like a new man. That's the dumbest thing I've heard yet, Enoch said. Go over there. No, there, no, to the left. Lie down over there. This court is in perpetual session. A woman was next, looking close to fainting. Don't be frightened, he said, in what he hoped was not too unctuous a fashion. I planted butterfly bushes once, but the butterflies didn't come. Yes, well, I've heard that employees in these mega gardening centers don't know what they're talking about. I even thought of suing them, not the butterflies, of course. She faded away and was replaced by a man who said in a loud, aggrieved voice, I want to work with survivors. I want to dig survivors out of the rubble and build privies and shelters. Fuck the earth. The earth is worthless. Long live the earth, who has freed us from the obligation to save her. You're not going to catch me serving the earth as if she were some sort of goddess. I want to serve my own kind. Remove him at once, Enoch said. As an afterthought, he said, give him some privies to build. I guess I'm next. Am I next? The young woman asked. Okay, then. My mother kept rabbits. She collected them. It was so embarrassing. People called her the bunny lady. Otherwise, she was normal. We had a little shed in the yard, which should have been my playhouse, but it was always full of rabbits. After I went to Yale, she was arrested for having so many rabbits, and I had to postpone. She was told not to go within 100 yards of a rabbit, but she violated her probation, and I was asked to postpone again, but I didn't. I didn't postpone. Now you want to know if you should have laughed or cried, Enoch said. That's right. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the time. What did you do? Neither. I went out and bought shoes. Then that was the wrong response, I guess, Enoch said. Is your mother still alive? Dead and buried now. They won't have to worry that she'll get within 100 yards of a rabbit anymore. Enoch said, have you heard the old belief that when you shiver for no reason, it's because a rabbit is running over your grave? The woman laughed in a projectile fashion before being led away. So it went, hundreds in an hour under his purview. And the things they tried to sneak past him. One old soul had arrived clutching her bottle of vinegar, the old-fashioned kind with that cobwebby stuff floating around in the bottom of it. They brought sandwiches, pills, and a libre with a broken tail. Some had pieces of plastic that once had given them anything they wanted, that they still clutched like amulets. Some were surprisingly argumentative, given the circumstances. One fellow strode before the bench and announced, "You ain't God." Enoch sighed, "I am not." He said, "Look at these pictures. Do you see the because I believe in God, and the God I believe in will bring me back like I've always been. Same way of doing things, same way of figuring, the same apprehensions," Enoch said, preferring formal usage. "I'm not apprehensive about nothing, because God will bring me back, and it will be me, not just someone like me. But I won't need to be concerned about what I've done or worry I should have done something different." "You regret nothing?" "Wouldn't question God, short stack." Jeffrey regarded him sourly. "Did anyone in your family cut that tunnel through Wawona?" "Through what?" "Wawona, the giant sequoia." "Oh, yeah, that tree older than Jesus that you could drive your car through for fun? One of my father's brothers did that. Real outdoorsy type, was able to sign on as part of the crew. My mother had a photograph of him, and it was in the kitchen for a while. Nobody ever called it Wawona, though." He looked somewhat stupefied, then bored, then impatient. Then he grabbed his chest and said something that sounded very much like, "Gah." "Oh, my," Jeffrey said. "I think I'm having a heart attack. Ow, it hurts like a motherfucker. Ow." He sank to the floor and disappeared. Jeffrey rose and peered over the great walled desk, but could see no sign of him. He had simply disappeared. Jeffrey hadn't even given a ruling, though it certainly would have been dismissal with extreme prejudice. It would have been well nigh impossible for the ruling to be arbitrary, capricious, contrary to law, and abuse of discretion, and not supported by objective evidence in this case. Maybe in the more obvious ones he should pick up the pace a bit. He hoped he wasn't losing focus. He felt at times almost bodiless. Just a massive 10-year-old brain presiding, or a blossom tossed about by the wind. The wind, how the wind had howled in that asylum by that aphotic lake. It was ceaseless. No wonder they'd all been nuts. You'd think his mother would have been more careful about their itinerary. He was the product of erratic parenting. When he was 6, she told him that when her time came, as she phrased it, she wanted to be cremated and her ashes stored in a martini shaker. He had said that he found the request exceedingly frivolous, and he would never honor it. She had accused him of having no sense of style, but the matter had not come up again. His mother. He hadn't thought of her in what seemed centuries. It was a peculiar day. He raised his arms, making the robes crepitate in that way that he liked, and thought again of that cloud land on the lake where elders and radical sickies prepared. He didn't know exactly how they'd gotten there, but he imagined the strange resolve descending upon them, like a cloud was the best he could ever come up with, for he did not have much of an imagination, he'd be the first to admit. In fact, he wasn't about to lose any sleep over, he who never slept. Maybe they saw death studying them in that weary, heavy-lidded way death affected, and they realized they didn't want to donate their organs or give their last nickel to that holier-than-thou kid tricycling for charity. They felt bad, and they would never feel good again, bad and mad. They didn't want to be reliable anymore, or well-adjusted, or accommodating, or moderate, or accepting. And then the cloud, which was not a cloud in the literal atmospheric sense, cloud, after all, arising from the Greek, buttock, for heaven's sakes, indicated to them something along the lines of, what do you have to lose? For society was still counting on them heavily to think they had something still to lose. He sympathized with the old delinquents, actually. And then she showed up and asked what had become of them. It was depressing. He was still peering into the space into which the fellow had vanished. Had he really called him short stack? That was perturbing. He raised his eyes and regarded his courtroom, the procedural unintelligibility of it all. Well, he'd wanted this. He wanted it very much. He called for a recess and retreated to his chambers. The cases would be piling up, he was well aware, men and women, even children, for he'd noticed one plane with a little truck rolling it back and forth would be creeping up the stairs in fetid flood if he continued to take these breaks. They'd smother him if they detected the slightest whiff of uncertainty or avoidance on his part. They'd roll right over him. Humanity could be quite overwhelming. Who was he kidding? Humanity was overwhelming. Goodness, how he would like to leave and seek her. He would pass through the court like a williwaw, leaving petitioners flailing to remain upright, their garments bloating out as though harboring the drowned. Someone would say, in deep space there's winds that blow 1,000,000 miles an hour, and this was like that. And someone else would be sure to contest it. A wind like that's unmeasurable. Someone's pulling your leg. There wasn't much he couldn't predict his court rats saying, querulous and opinionated as they were to the end. She'd been right here before him, and he had dismissed her. He had invited her back, yes, but would she be able to return? He couldn't leave to go to her. His own masters wouldn't let him, and they'd been good to him, kept him as a kid, allowed him all the bells and whistles, the robes and polished rails, allowed him ultimate authority over all who had lived so carelessly and onerously on the earth with such savagely entitled abandon, and even those who hadn't. They had allowed him his incommutable sentences. The only thing they hadn't allowed was the bringing back of his tata, his grandfather, whose murder at the hands of his simple-minded devil of a father Jeffrey still had difficulty comprehending. The murder of the father, heinous, heinous, only murder of the mother being more so. A collective action proceeding pretty much without cease if you addressed it in the lyrical entirety of Mother Planet. Oh, he couldn't wait until she returned. Don't wait, then, his grandfather would tease when Jeffrey would squeak his enthusiasm for some promised upcoming outing, a trial lawyers' convention, tea with a retired federal judge, a visit to juvenile court. The juvies frightened him somewhat, actually. Then don't wait, his grandfather would say solemnly. Do anything but wait. And Jeffrey would never fail to find this amusing. His grandfather was known for his dry as a desert wit, how he loved him. Ashes now, no more than the ashes of a book that had been poked about in a fire to provoke a moment's warmth. He did not understand how he could have gone living after his grandfather died, after he knew his grandfather had died, for there had been 7 days when he had not known, and when he had missed him as one merely misses the temporary absence of a living loved one. There were no phones in the queer place where his mother had deposited them for a holiday. That was the explanation she had given for the disturbing silence from home. When he'd whined and inquired further, his mother told him that Thomas Edison had failed in his attempt to build a phone that he anticipated would bear messages back and forth across the veil. And if Thomas Edison had failed, wasting years of his life and becoming half dotty by the quest, it was unlikely that such an apparatus could be found even where they were. Jeffrey hadn't known what she was talking about. His grandfather had never spoken of Thomas Edison, thus he could not be of the bar and was of little consequence. His mother's pronouncements had become more and more irregular and incomplete due to her drinking. 7 days and not a sign, though he tortured himself frequently with the thought that his grandfather had appeared to him during that time on the shore of that disorienting lake, that he had in fact appeared as the small and helpless fish he'd caught. Jeffrey took a deep and shaky breath. He had hyperventilated before when considering this. He had almost lost it, actually, when that very person, the interesting case, had brought up the soul like the fish in the sea, like the sea in the fish business. He shoved his hands in his mouth and chewed. Oh, that dreadful lake, that awful place with its drifting shades. How had his mother even come across it? It must have been by accident. But she behaved as though it had been their destination all the while. "We want your nicest room," she demanded at the desk. But of course, there were no nicest rooms. Outside was even worse. There was a warped ping-pong table lacking a net, a structure with baffling signage towards which the other guests had streamed with disturbing ceremony, and a not very clean swimming pool. What if he'd wanted swimming lessons? What if he'd wanted his mother to place her hand beneath his fragile spine and support him in clean, cool waters? Beneath his vulnerable body would be a hand, and the palm of this hand would be the point of secure, serene balance upon which he would float. What if he'd wanted that? He did not know how to swim to this day, and nobody seemed to eat there. The place certainly took away his appetite, though in the beginning he'd missed his morning wheat germ. His mother had packed no bags for them. He didn't even have his Black's Law Dictionary or his dental floss. And then they left as abruptly as they had arrived, and it was that night that his mother, in the bubble of their speeding car, had told him that his Tata, his only advocate and ally, was dead. He had been sing-songing to himself, having recently discovered the struggling field of animal law. Animal use law, prohibits any necropsy or surgical procedure on an animal within the sight of other animals of the same species, he warbled, which was interesting, really interesting, in that it acknowledged the distress and empathy of animals over what? He said. I believe the disagreement between your father and your grandfather was over procedural rather than substantive matters, she said, making every effort to present it in a way he'd appreciate. When he said nothing, she said, your father will probably get off on the self-defense gambit, for your grandfather did brandish a stone paperweight at him. Which stone paperweight? Jeffrey said. What a funny question. It's practically inappropriate. He has many stone paperweights. Any rock can become metamorphic, his Tata had told him. Well, perhaps he had. Take it back what you said. Don't be difficult, Jeffrey. There's nothing Mother can do about it. Now you know what's what, and we have to get back to what's what. He was silent. Jeffrey, his mother said, don't play with your thoughts. He had seized the wheel then. His mother screamed and, struggling with him, quite naturally lost control of the vehicle, which rolled and rolled as though it were a perfect orb designed to roll forever before it cast him out to stand alone on a dark road. Jeffrey's head was pounding. He must be dehydrated. He poured water from the carafe into a shallow cup and studied it. for a moment before gulping it down. The Greeks had their oracles of the dead, which appeared as visions in pools or certain pans of water. He'd never been granted such a vision, not as much as a peek. He had to be content with the constant revelation that most of what passed as the substance of life was nothing. For a while as a child, he had harbored the notion that when someone you were fond of died, it was yourself who disappeared. It began with his grandmother. She must have been baffled when everyone and everything she'd surrounded herself with vanished. Her brilliant husband, her frivolous son, and his awful wife, right down to her wispy grandson, her pet koi, and the wedding ring she was always taking off and misplacing when she washed the dishes. It was yourself who disappeared, the one who was supposed to be left, and you were never that person again. He could hear the crowd below him multiplying. Really, he was falling further and further behind. Sometimes he tried to perceive them all as sacred clowns, holding nothing sacred. They point the way to the sacred. But he could not do this often, practically never. The sound was quite extraordinary. He remembered the description in an old book of a phenomenon long since vanished from the world, the sound of birds, of migrating wings passing through the darkness, in countless harmonies with a velvety rustle, long drawn out. This was not that. It was a rumbling, metallic, demanding cacophony, murderously sociable, pathologically multiplying. He rushed down to them in a rage and did a week's work in an hour before retreating once more to his chambers, feeling a bit off his game. His Tata always allowed his opponent to state his whole case, making sure the other had nothing more to say before the implacable rejoinder came. His Tata was a man made of dynamite. He spoke, and suddenly everything was inverted. All previous certainties were made questionable, everything reasonably argued preposterous. His irrefutable triumph was thrilling to observe, a magic show, a pure confoundment. He allowed himself a moment of wild adoration for the old man, then several more, resigning his father to ever deeper hells. But Geoffrey was not his grandfather, alas, and the interesting case was not an opponent. His divine opposite, perhaps, his challenge and check. She saw the tears and things which he did not. He saw only the injustice. Every person under his purview considered themselves unique as snowflakes, but in the aggregate they were a blizzard, a whiteout of swirling expectation and denial. Yet still, the rumor in his courtroom was that if his opinion was favorable, one should have no fear. If unfavorable, no hope, which was pretty darn flattering to overhear. Praise, practically. The truth of the matter was his judgments scarcely varied. Scarcely do we inhume the wreckage of our lives and we dig it up again. That's why we keep on, and keep on, never progressing except in the grossest and most mundane fashion, he would sometimes confide. And then she appears and says she wants to take up the work of living for the first time, art of living, she'd actually said, which he corrected. She was thinking without the right words. She should just go to the next step of thinking with no words at all. He was able to do this on occasion, though the moment always caught him unaware, and he found it wonderfully refreshing and instructive. That was no way to explain it, of course. His masters had brought them together, but were they her masters as well? If they were, he thought somewhat anxiously, they might be requiring more of her than of him. Sometimes he even wondered if they were following his labors anymore, if the minute distinctions he did make were of any concern to them. What if she were the world's last night? Isn't that the great theological question? What if this present were the world's last night? Or one of the great questions, anyway. Those who cared had so many of them. But the governing authority, of which his court was very much not a part, was taking increasing measures to eliminate night. Instinctively, if not metaphysically, they sensed the final reckoning and determined, being sovereign and all, that they would not be outreckoned. Unnatural light would suffuse the all as soon as natural light began to wane. That was the assurance and the goal. Night generated unhealthy thinking anyway, and they found that people had no trouble sleeping without darkness. They'd be sleeping anyway. In the most profound sense, they were always sleeping. Even she slept, he suspected, for she couldn't remember her death, which had been given to her for a purpose after all. She was a human child. She wasn't born in a buttercup. She had endured the brief and starving banality of one of those last childhoods before eluding the great attrition and corresponding resolve of the survivors, before being cosseted by brooding over the hill econuts, whose concern for the tusked and shelled, the finned and winged, made them the shame of their species, and more outcasts than any Israel goat of the Hebrews. And now she was here, the last of her kind, or the first, the difficulties being the same, having realized her situation only when she became alone, when her familiars had vanished with the vanquished world. But what was the point of coming back from the dead, if only to visit the dead? He tidied the papers on his desk once more. There were no dogs in the Kafka story. He wondered what else he'd been wrong about. He resumed staring into the dish of water. There was a small insect there, a spider, imperceptibly translucent, floating not on the water, but seemingly on an invisible film above it. It puzzled him, for the sterility of his chambers he had never questioned. It puzzled him, for he could not ever remember seeing a spider before, which surely was impossible. The spider brings the web out of herself and then lives in it. Remarkable. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks so much.
We're not doing a Q&A because there's the new protocol, but we're so grateful to all of you for coming. And Joy, that was mesmerizing. That was amazing. If you haven't yet read Harrow, please just go home and read it. Stay up in the moonlight, which is beautiful. Perfect night for reading Harrow. We still have the darkness for now. But thank you, Joy, for bringing this. Thank you.
We have books here. We went through a whole bunch of trouble behind the scenes to get these books. So please, if you don't have the book, please, if you can, support us sort of gathering the books and having them here for you. And Joy will also be signing books for you. So that's like a really big treat. And this is actually Joy's second only in-person reading. So it's an honor to have you, Joy. You're such an inspiration to me and so many writers, and I just can't explain just how much it means to be here and listen to you. So thank you so much, and buy books. And Joy's here signing. So thank you.